Welcome to the Pro Social Workers Podcast, the place where social work meets diversity, dialogue, and ethical practice. Here we offer courses that promote viewpoint and political diversity while fostering human connection. And the best part? Our content is completely free to access. For professional social workers and interested others, we provide the option to earn continuing education credits with a simple fee after listening to our episodes. Go to prosocialworkers.com to learn more. Together, we'll explore how to truly put the social back into social work. So, tune in, get inspired, and join us on this journey towards a more inclusive and connected future.
Hello, and welcome to the Pro Social Podcast. I'm Matt Watson, the Executive Director and co-founder of Pro Social Workers. And our Pro Social Podcast is affiliated with Pro Social Workers, and we are part of the Institute for Liberal Values. Today, I'm joined by my co-founder, Zander Keig, and our guest presenter, Amanda Smith. And we're going to be talking today a little bit about the dialectical social worker. And Zander introduced me to Amanda, and we've had a great conversation. And Zander, tell us a little bit about how you and Amanda crossed paths, and then let's hear from Amanda.
Well, initially, Amanda reached out to Dr. Nafis Salam, who's also involved with Pro Social Workers. And then he connected her, I think, with me or maybe us, but I responded first, I believe. And we got to talking, and I learned all about Amanda's work with DBT, and also social workers are awesome, which I recommend social workers definitely sign up. It's a great little email that you get every morning on weekdays that has a lot of great information. I found myself clicking on almost every link that you post in that email every day, Amanda. So thank you for that. And so I thought that Amanda would be a good person to bring on the podcast. We had a conversation outside of the podcast about what she's doing, what I'm doing, what we're doing, and it looked like a really good match. And so I sent her your way, Matt, and here we are. So we're going to be talking about, how dialectical behavioral therapy can be used by social workers to actually humanize and create dialogue across differences, which is exactly why Pro Social Worker was started in the first place. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. So I'm glad you're here, Amanda, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. I am so excited about sharing dialectical thinking, dialectical practice with more social workers. So I'm so happy to be with you. Thanks.
Great. Amanda, help us get to know you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and provide a little bit of an introduction for us.
So I started out my career in mental health by serving as the executive director of NAMI. So this was the Pinellas County, Florida NAMI affiliate. So I've been affiliated with NAMI in one way or another for now almost 20 years. So this is an organization that is near and dear to my heart. It's a mental health organization I really loved. And then a couple years later, I founded a nonprofit organization called Florida Borderline Personality Disorder Association. I am no longer living in Florida. I haven't been in Florida for many years now. But I'm so glad that this organization continues to exist under the leadership of another social worker. So I'm excited about that. Um, 14, 15 years ago, I created Hope for BPD. And the idea was that I wanted to help connect individuals with a diagnosis or traits of borderline personality disorder with professional help where they lived in Florida. So I connected those people. We put on some conferences and some training. So that was a pretty um, a really fun time of my life being able to do some of that work. Now, today I am intensively trained in dialectical behavior therapy. I also publish a daily email called My Dialectical Life, where I teach a DBT skill every single day. I'm also the author of a couple of books. A decade ago, I wrote, published the Dialectical Behavior Therapy Wellness Planner. And then in just a few weeks, and this is supposed to read 2025, my book is being published, the Self Compassion Workbook for BPD, DBT skills to find self forgiveness, healing, and self love. So I'm excited that that's coming out in just a matter of a few weeks. So
Well, that sounds wonderful. It sounds like you're really passionate about dialectical behavior.
I am. It's absolutely changed my life and both personally and professionally. And I'm excited about how some of these ideas help my clients, their family members. So I see lots of benefit for many different people.
Right. Well, hopefully we can use that as social workers, especially when we're dealing with emotions that come up when dealing with ambiguous or potentially conflictual situations. And in our work, we obviously try to dialogue across differences and promote viewpoint and political diversity in social work. So perhaps these skills will help us a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit, Amanda, about what about dialectical behavior therapy and give us a little bit of an intro?
Sure, absolutely. If you go to the next slide, I think I have a little information. So, DBT is an evidence based treatment. So, there is now going on 35 years of published research to show that DBT is a highly effective treatment for a lot of different populations. So the treatment was developed by Marsha Linehan. So she was at the University of Washington in Seattle. DBT was originally developed to treat individuals with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, but it's now been adapted to help people with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, eating disorders, addictions. There's now an adaptation for ADHD. Um, Also, there's an adaptation to help caregivers. So there's a lot of different populations we can help with DBT. So that's something that's really pretty exciting, not just for me, but for certainly for many of my colleagues as well, to see these different ways of using this treatment. So we know that DBT may be helpful for many different disorders, many different problems where we see a lot of impulsive behaviors or where we see a lot of emotional dysregulation. So and I tell my clients, if you're a human walking around, you probably at one time or another experience a lot of emotional dysregulation. So this isn't just for people with a specific diagnosis, but potentially these skills and ideas are really for all of us.
Absolutely. Amanda, I'm wondering what got you interested in going so far into DBT? I mean, it's one thing for people to have a theoretical orientation and utilize different treatment modalities, but to start an organization, publish a daily email, write books. I mean, that's really going into DBT all the way.
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely. So when I was with NAMI, one of the things that came up again and again, and at this time, NAMI was a very different organization 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. And they were not at that time addressing personality disorders. So that was not included under the umbrella of disorders or diagnoses that they would help educate people, that they would help people who needed referrals or needed information about good providers. So NAMI has now included personality disorders under that umbrella, but at the time they hadn't. So when I was working with people with a diagnosis, with family members, with professionals through NAMI, one of the problems that came up was, well, where is the help for people with personality disorders? And specifically because there's often a high utilization of services, especially emergency and crisis support services, there was clearly a need, and that need was not necessarily being met through NAMI at that time. So I thought, well, I'll go ahead and I'll start, a nonprofit organization. And because I wanted people to get the help that they needed. And I knew that there was effective evidence based treatment to help people. But I wanted to, again, my goal was to help connect people who are suffering with help that was going to be, again, evidence based, help that was going to be appropriate, help that was going to make a real difference in their life. And it quickly became clear that for most people who were suffering, DBT was going to be an answer. DBT was going to make a pretty big difference for a lot of people. So it just kind of came together, and it just really felt like, wow, this is something I really want to get behind, and something I want to create a career out of.
How have things changed now since the access system, right? The matrix with access to the personality disorders was removed from DSM-5. And I know it can be quite controversial to even talk about personality disorders. So is this why DBT has kind of expanded to incorporate more things it can deal with? Has there been some controversy about personality disorders and DBT as a result?
Absolutely. And I think that the controversy has been going on for many, many decades now. And I think that for the longest period of time, and this is what I heard when I was with NAMI, was this idea of, well, people with this particular diagnosis or that particular diagnosis, they're not going to get better or they're not going to improve. And for me, that just felt like I just felt like I don't know that that's true. I don't know that that's accurate. There's clearly a need here that's not being met. So, with the changes in the DSM, I think a lot of them have been positive, and I think at the same time, the DSM, I think, is still problematic, at least some of the time. So I want to recognize that there is something positive in helping people to understand themselves, and that can come from having a diagnosis. And at the same time, I want to always kind of be careful to help my clients see that they're more than a diagnosis, and just because you may have a diagnosis of BPD or have traits of BPD does not mean that you're going to continue to have those traits, or you're going to have to continue to have that diagnosis throughout the course of your lifetime. Again, we have so much evidence now to suggest that people who go through DBT um, may not have the diagnosis, may not meet diagnostic criteria after a year of treatment or 2 years of treatment or 3 years of treatment. So we just want to be careful, I think, in diagnosing with someone with a personality disorder without also explaining that there are a lot of reasons for people to be hopeful, especially when people have access to an evidence-based treatment like DBT.
That's great. I I would agree that, and we'll likely have a subsequent podcast on this, or a course about the controversy of diagnostic labeling
Mhm.
and what that means and how it can sometimes be misunderstood, uh, not just by consumers but by the general public. And so I like what you're doing here, and appreciate that it's not necessarily diagnostic specific.
Absolutely, it is not.
So tell us a little bit more about it, and how it might compare to other therapies.
Absolutely. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So, DBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. So, it's a form of CBT. However, so we're taking CBT or we're taking parts of CBT, but we're adding dialectical thinking, we're adding mindfulness, and we're adding validation or acceptance strategies to the treatment. So that's what sets this apart from CBT alone. So
So tell
dialectic,
us a little bit.
yeah,
Yeah. What do you mean by dialectics? Can you describe that?
sure. So dialectical thinking, and we've got another slide on that coming up, I know. Um, But in a nutshell, dialectical thinking is a way of thinking or a way of problem solving that helps us to navigate the middle. We'll sometimes call this the middle path. So we can think about how many people with a lot of emotional dysregulation will get caught up in a lot of black and white or all or nothing thinking. And when we begin to teach people how to think dialectically, they're able to move from that place of that black and white, all or nothing thinking and move toward the middle. So they're able to navigate the grays, they're able to navigate things that are more nuanced for a lot of people without getting caught in polarizing thinking or action. And again, I think this is not just an idea for individuals with a particular diagnosis, but I really think that there is something for all social workers with dialectical thinking. Like, I think dialectical thinking has something to offer social work as a field, also social work as individuals who are navigating complex, challenging systems. So
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons why I love dialectics.
What seems very relevant to the work that we do within pro social workers is we're looking at viewpoint and political diversity and being able to recognize that two truths, maybe two different truths, two different sides of a coin, both can be true and can coexist as part of living in a pluralistic society. And so that dialectic seems to be really relevant to some of the work that we do, and that's one of the reasons we're eager to hear from you. So keep going. This is really interesting.
Terrific. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you so much. So I want to review some of these clinical assumptions, and then the next slide will make even a little more sense about why I think that these are important. But these are some of the clinical assumptions that come with DBT. So all of my clients know, or they've at least heard of these. We talk about them in our group, or I share them with these ideas with my clients. And so I'm going to quickly review them, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why or how these might also apply to social work as a field, but also to social workers as individuals. So, the first things that we talk about how patients or clients are doing the best that they can, and how clients also want to improve. Clients need to do better, try harder, and be more motivated to change. Clients may not have caused all of their own problems, but they have to solve them anyway. The lives of suicidal borderline individuals are unbearable as they are currently being lived. Clients must learn new behaviors in all relevant contexts. Clients cannot fail in therapy. And then finally, therapists treating clients with BPD need support. So, again, this is one of the foundations of dialectical behavior therapy that I think also sets DBT apart from a lot of other treatments. But here are the applications, I believe, for the field of social work and for social workers as individuals. So, I also think about how social workers are doing the best that they can. So we have this idea in DBT, the client's doing the best that they can. Well, what about the social worker? Or what about the therapist? And from my perspective, I believe that social workers are doing the best that they can. The next one is this idea that we can, again, borrow from the previous slide, this idea that social workers want to improve. So at any given moment, I want to improve. I want to improve my skills. I want to improve my knowledge. I want to improve how I work. So I'm working to improve. That's not going to stop. As long as I'm a licensed social worker, I want to continue to improve. The next idea is that social workers need to do better, try harder, and be more motivated to change. And again, I think about for my own practice, I also want to recognize that I need to do better. I'm doing the best that I can, but it's also true that I need to do better. I can try harder. And I can think about that motivation to change the things about my practice that I want to change or the things that I desire to change. The next idea is that social workers may not have caused all of their own problems, but we still have a responsibility to solve those problems. So when I think about all the problems I have during any given day, I think about maybe some of the problems I've played a part in, and then there are other problems that I haven't. And maybe it doesn't matter if I've brought the problems or the problems have come to me, I still have that responsibility to solve them. And then finally, borrowed from the previous slide, this idea that it's not just therapists who need support, but we can also think about who else needs support. Well, social workers need support. So we can think about where am I getting that support? Again, we can think about social workers as a group, but also individuals, or we can think about social workers at a particular agency. How are they getting the support that they need? Are they getting the support from each other, or is there someone coming in from the outside to give that support? So I think about how these ideas from DBT are not just applicable for clients, but they're probably applicable to all of us. So it's just something that I keep in mind, like I'm doing the best that I can. And again, simultaneously, I need to improve. There are things I can be doing better. It's true for my clients, but it's absolutely 100% true for me as well.
That's great. That's great. And you can just see the relevance, of course, in social workers. I like how you've applied that to us as we're engaging in, different practice. So thank you for sharing that in that application.
Thank
I
you.
also wanted to add that I remember in my MSW program, they would fairly regularly ask us about our self-care practices. Um, Not that we got a lot of training in what self-care is, but we were somehow supposed to figure it out and do it on our own time. And then out in the workplace, it was the same thing. And even in the internships, there would be a nod to make sure you're taking care of yourself, make sure you're doing your self-care, but there was nothing within the system, that was built in to provide that for the workers, for the interns, in environments that were highly stressful, child welfare, residential psychiatric inpatient, detox, substance abuse treatment. I mean, we're talking, homeless shelters. It's it could be very stressful work, but the idea was, when you're not at work, you're doing self-care. And you know, most people were doing self-soothing or self-comforting activities, but not self-care activities. And so that idea of like who's responsible for making sure that the employee of the social worker at the agency or um, in the group practice, or, like whose responsibility is it? Is it 100% the social worker, or is there partly the employer? And what does that mean? Nowadays, it's more common for employers, especially very large employers, to have wellness programs that go beyond paying for your gym membership or providing you with, a discount, on a Fitbit, right? They're much more involved in providing well-being workshops and therapy and coaching to their employees. But now that's a fairly new um, phenomenon. So this idea of social workers needing support, and I think part of that should be the responsibility of the employer of those social workers.
It's a great point, especially where the NASW Code of Ethics, the most recent version, includes self-care. The part of ethical practice is taking care of yourself so you're available to help others. So great, great suggestion there, Amanda. This is excellent.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So let's dive into dialectics, dialectical thinking. So this is a very old idea. So this was part of a philosophy developed by Hegel in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And these ideas, even though they're several hundred years old, may help social workers to navigate between the extremes that we find in some of our own all or nothing or black and white thinking. And this is a pretty simple formula. And while it's simple, it's also, I want to recognize that this is pretty challenging for most of us. So we start out with a thesis. So the thesis might be, I'm right. That's my thesis. I am right. And then we look at the antithesis. So what's the exact opposite? Well, it might be I'm wrong or they're wrong. I'm right, they're wrong. And so we can look at what is the opposite. What's the opposite? And then we want to look at the synthesis. So what's in the middle? What's in the middle of I'm right, they're wrong, or I'm right, I'm wrong? And it might look like something that sounds like, I can see their point of view, or I can see where they're coming from, or I can see, how they got that idea or why they believe what they believe. The second example is the thesis might sound like, the way forward involves a commitment to change. And then the antithesis, the opposite, maybe we think, actually the way forward is through acceptance, acceptance of self or acceptance of others. That's the way forward. And then we can, again, look for that synthesis or that middle path. So we can find a way to support both change and acceptance. So again, this is something that has helped me, not just as a social worker, but this has certainly helped me personally at any given moment when I start to engage in some all or nothing thinking, or I have that moment where I think I'm right, I've got to be right, I know I'm right, or I must be right. I've been doing this for so long now, and I've been teaching these ideas to my clients for such a long time that I immediately pull back, or I pull back most of the time, and I think, okay, what's the other side? What's the opposite? I'm imagining that I am right. I'm imagining that there's only one way to see this situation or to understand the problem. But what about the exact opposite? What does it look like for that person or that group or someone who just believes the exact opposite of what I'm believing or what I'm valuing? And then if I can identify that, I can usually find that middle. So it's an interesting way. I think about it as, um, it's an intellectual exercise that's rooted in philosophy, but it's a way to help all of us get unstuck from this idea of I'm right. Has to be the way. This has to be, you know, how everyone sees or understands this particular problem. So just by understanding, naming, describing what we believe or what we think, and then identifying the exact opposite can be a way for us to find that synthesis. So this is what I teach my clients to do. This is a way to develop some more flexible thinking so that people can stay or at least let go of some of the polarizing thoughts that they sometimes have, thoughts that keep them stuck in maladaptive patterns or maladaptive behaviors. So again, this isn't just for people with a specific diagnosis. um, Hegel certainly didn't develop this idea with the idea that this was going to be a treatment for a specific set of people. So I think that there's some wisdom in this dialectical thinking or this dialectical approach for lots of different people.
Amanda, I'm wondering if you could maybe give us an example. Like if you're talking with a client or patient and you're getting the impression that they're coming from a place of, I'm right about this, would you interrupt or break in to confirm with them? It sounds like you think you're right about this issue. Does that mean then that you think this other person is wrong about it? And then if they say, well, yeah, what would be the next step? Is there anything that they believe based on what you've heard? Because I'm thinking that there could be a lot of assumptions here. We assume we're right. We assume the other person's wrong. We don't really know exactly that they're the opposite, but it is this polarized way of thinking. It's like, then you would introduce it reminds me of a different kind of therapy. I forget which model it is, where you remind people that there are exceptions to their way of thinking. It's like, I can't do it. Well, I've seen you do this and that and the other thing. So would it go something like, is there anything that they've said or done that makes it so that they're not absolutely wrong? Like, walk us through, how would you actually navigate that conversation?
Sure, absolutely. So I did this earlier today with a client. I was working with a client I've been working with for quite some time. She began to um, be a little polarized when she was talking about a conversation she had with a friend last week. And I kind of stopped her and I said, this might be a great moment to practice some dialectical thinking. Is that something that you want to do? Is that something you're open to doing? I'm so thankful this client said yes. And so I said, okay, all right, tell me more about your side. Tell me more about how you see this problem. Tell me why this is important to you. I want to hear more. So the client was able to talk about why this particular issue was so meaningful to her. She was able to talk about her values and the issue. I said, fantastic. I love all of this. I said, now I want you to take the other side. What would the other side look like? I've been working with this client for a while, so we've been through these kind of exercises before. She did it so beautifully. She was able to speak very eloquently about what the other side might think, what they might believe, what they might value. And then, even though this was not, I wasn't prompting her to do this, but she was able to find that middle path very quickly. Now, this client is not going to change her values. She's not going to change her beliefs. She's not going to, just because she was able to talk about, what someone else might think or feel does not change her position. However, one of the benefits of thinking dialectically is we become more emotionally regulated. And I've seen this again and again and again over now a dozen years. When people are able to extend even a small amount of understanding, compassion, grace, empathy to the other side, it's something that seems to be inherently regulating.
Mm,
If people are able to do that
that's great.
constantly, yeah, it's so beautiful to watch. So again, the
It's
goal is,
depolarizing. Yeah.
yeah,
It sounds like, not only do you enjoy better emotional regulation, but it just sounds like you're more likely to be open to others, more relationally oriented, more social, more pro-social. Um, it kind of
absolutely.
reminds me of the concept of steel manning or star manning, or don't mind me using the gendered term there, but um, that you're trying to, describe the other side as accurately as you can. It certainly does invite a little bit of peace. That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Amanda.
And again, I think it's so wonderful to watch when it begins to unfold. But I want to emphasize one more time, the goal isn't, oh, we want this person to change their mind, or we want this person to value something different. So that's one of the things that I love so much about this idea and about this approach is that we're not asking other people to change their values or their beliefs or their ideas, just to acknowledge that there's another side and that there may be a kernel of truth in the other side. That's it.
I think that I think that oftentimes people do think that a person who has a different perspective and they're voicing that they are wanting to change the mind of the other person.
Mhm.
And it might be accurate. There are people that definitely want to do that. They engage in debate rather than dialogue. Um, and they're arguing rather than just, communicating. And so I don't think people are mistaken in that assumption that people might be trying to make them change. But ultimately, regardless of whether the person is trying to change your mind or your views or your values or not, it's up to you whether you're going to do that. And so we don't have to take the bait when people are trying to do that. They're initiating that through the regulation. We can find a place to respond to them in a non-defensive way, right? Because we can't actually control whether a person is trying to change our mind or not, but we can have control over how we respond to what that person is doing, and just setting aside the assumption that their whole goal is to change us could benefit the relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love the idea of people coming together with some understanding, even when differences exist. People have different ideas, people have different values, people have different goals. It's a normal part of being a human. So I love that. Everyone doesn't have to think the way I think. Everyone doesn't have to believe the way I believe. But when we are curious enough to try to understand the other person's point of view, then I from my perspective, it's again, it's a recipe for emotional health, connection, healthier relationships, greater understanding. So, yeah.
Today's an interesting day. October 14th, we're recording this. Do you know whose birthdays? There are two significant people whose birthday is today. It is today, 1973 was when George Floyd was born. Today, 20 years later, 1993 was the day Charlie Kirk was born.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be interesting to hear people who identify and value each of these individuals and their death, as to the degree that they might be able to see the dialectic or the a different way of looking at the other person, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting cross section today of two individuals that have certainly drawn different perspectives from different people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And another opportunity to potentially think dialectically, to engage in dialectical
Exactly.
thinking, and to maybe even find a synthesis that feels accurate, that feels true, that feels genuine. Again, without asking anyone to change their minds or um come over to the other side 100%. We're not asking anyone to do that.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I think about the NASW values and the ethical standards, the ethical principles. And I was just thinking about how, maybe we can, value social justice and think dialectically. Or maybe we can honor the dignity and the worth of the person and also be dialectical. Maybe we can think about the importance of our relationships with each other, also be dialectical. And I think there's room for honesty and integrity when we're also being dialectical. So I don't think that these are, well, you can do this, but you can't do this. I think there really can be an integration with the NASW values. I also think about the just the idea of respect. When I'm trying to understand someone else's point of view, why they believe the way they do, their values, their interests, their goals, I'm showing respect to that other person, or it can be a sign of respect. I know that when people take a moment or two to try to understand my perspective, then I feel respected as well. So it's just kind of a nice reminder that this can help us to get to this place of mutual respect with other social workers, with other professional colleagues. Certainly, when we think about our relationship with our clients, then respect is going to be important as well. So we can think about, and I think at some point, I think we're all guilty of, like, well, I don't agree with this person. So again, we fall back into that place of, well, I'm right. I know I've got to be right. And if I'm right, that means that the other person is wrong. So just thinking about, okay, well, then in that moment, where is there room for respect? Where is there room for building respect with the other person? So I just love this from the NASW, just this reminder that this is an important goal in social work. When we think about the people we work with, when we think about agencies, when we think about organizations, when we think about larger systems, we want to remember, how are we respecting others? And then what does that look like? And what happens when, again, there's a difference of opinion, we have different values, or maybe we have different goals? Is there still room for respect? And I think that there is, and at times I want to admit that I still occasionally need this reminder. How am I showing respect to others? Or am I that person who sometimes, again, gets caught in this idea of, well, I'm right, so that must mean that someone else is wrong. And of course, that's not necessarily true.
We've had the conversation before on our podcast and in other opportunities that Matt and I have had to talk about this issue of social justice within the social work profession and how it's interpreted, right? And how it is practiced. And we've talked about it loosely as classical social justice versus critical social justice. And so I had an opportunity recently to be involved in it was a lot of different kinds of therapists in a Zoom room together. And the issue of social justice came up, and I had made a comment about how there's different ways to interpret it. And a social worker did a copy paste of the social justice section from the NASW Code of Ethics and was like, there's no interpretation. Here it is. And I was like, well, but there's a lot of room there for how we're going to interpret it and how we're going to practice it. But they couldn't see that. All they could see was the exact words that were written and their interpretation of what those words meant. And therefore, that was the only application of social justice. It was very interesting to just sort of see it in practice like that. Yeah.
That's so interesting and not surprising. And again, I've been there. I've been that person who an issue comes up, I have a strong value or I have a strong belief, and I'm like, well, here it is. This has to be the answer. And it it would be so wonderful if that's how life worked most of the time. And I think most of the time things are so complex and challenging, and um yeah, I always think that there's room for different interpretations. I also want to be that person who's open to, listening to something that I may not have considered, or that I may not yet understand in the way that someone else may understand. Doesn't mean that I'm going to change my mind necessarily, but I at least, again, I also think that's a sign of respect, that we're open to truly hearing the other person.
I think, if you think about it dialectically, what I think what we could say then is that a social worker who takes the lens of social justice from the critical point of view is perfectly within the code of ethics to use that lens in the application of the work that they're doing in their practice of their agency. And another social worker who's going to take a different perspective on social justice, that's more of what we'd consider like a classical, like a civil rights versus a liberation orientation towards social justice, can use that in their practice or their agency, and that they can both coexist, and they're neither one are violating the code of ethics, which is how Matt and I met initially, because there were people within the field who were making broad claims that there were certain types of people who shouldn't be allowed to be social workers, primarily because of their religious or their political views, or who they voted for specifically, meant that they were unethical and therefore violating the code of ethics and should be stripped of their license solely based on that, because there was no wiggle room on these issues. There was no dialectical lens applied at all.
Right, right, right. And again, I always like it when, I have a colleague or I've had a supervisor or I've had a client who pushes back and says, think about it in this way, or what you don't know is this. Amanda, I want you to think about it from, from this particular perspective or history. I think makes a difference.
One that really enriches us. It helps us to broaden our perspective, to consider things that we hadn't seen before, to recognize our own blind spots, our own biases. It makes us much more effective as social workers when we engage these dialectics.
Absolutely agree. All right, should we go to the next slide? So, one of the things that we also think a lot about in DBT is how are we validating each other? So, just to define validation, means that we're helping to communicate an understanding of someone else's values, their emotions, their thoughts, and experiences. And again, what a beautiful way to show respect to other people. I understand you believe this way, or this is how you're feeling, or this is what you're thinking, or this is what you've experienced. So on the next slide, we have different ways of validating other people. This is one of those things I think most social workers are already familiar with. Most of us are doing this no matter what our roles are. But it's just kind of a nice reminder to think about, how am I validating others today? How am I validating family members, friends, clients, colleagues, people on LinkedIn, people I only know through email? How am I validating others? So we can think about, are we present? Are we present with another person or with a group of people? Or are we that person and we're distracted? We're looking at our phone, or we're looking at another screen, or we're in front of someone, but we're adding to the grocery list of what we need to order or buy later tonight or tomorrow morning? Or are we thinking about our next meeting or our next client or the problem that came up at 1 o'clock this afternoon? How present are we? The more present we can be, the more validating it is. The next one is this idea of accurate reflection. So if I tell you, wow, I had a really tough day, I had this problem and I had this problem, and then another problem came up, and then you reflect back and say, wow, you've had so many problems come up today. Well, then I feel heard. I feel like, yeah, 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 I have had so many problems that have come up today. So that's that idea of accurate reflection. And then the next way to validate others is by reading that person's behavior and then making an educated guess about what they might be feeling. So we can think about the person we encounter in the hallway or in the elevator. Maybe that person has their head down, or maybe it looks like they're frowning, or that they're deep in thought. We can read that person's behavior and then make a guess about what might be happening with them. Then we want to, we need to start verbalizing that. We want to have more reflection. Wow, it looks like you've had a hard day, or it looks like you might be really tired. What's going on or what's happening. Number 4 is understanding a person's behavior in terms of their history or their biology. So, this absolutely comes up when we're working with people, and we are doing some kind of trauma informed care. So, we're recognizing that there may be people in our practices or at their agencies who have experienced trauma. So we're sensitive to that trauma or that trauma history. And by that sensitivity and awareness, we're being validating to those individuals. Also, we can think about how normalizing a person's behaviors or their emotional reactions can be validating. So I might say to a client, yeah, it makes sense that you're feeling sad today because of this or because of that. So we're normalizing those behaviors. We're talking about how the behaviors make sense or the emotions are valid. And then number 6, this is hard to do, but boy, does it make a difference. So Marsha Linehan calls this radical genuineness. This moment where we are real and we're genuine and we're kind of putting it all out there. We're sharing maybe something a little more vulnerable with the person in front of us. We're being ourselves. And she calls that radical genuineness. And in her book, she talks about how we want to aim whenever possible for the highest level of validation. So if we can, you know, go right to that radical genuineness, we want to be able to do that. Of course, we're not always able to do that. So we can start by just being present, or we can start with that accurate reflection, and then we can move towards radical genuineness. For some of us, depending on our agencies or organizations or practices, it may take us weeks or months or years to get to that place of radical genuineness with clients or our colleagues. So we can think about how these validation strategies can build over a long period of time. All right.
So these are sequential. The 6 is the highest level, 5 is the next highest level. Is that what she's suggesting?
Yes, so 6 is the
Okay,
highest level. So
right.
whenever we want to, be real with people, like we go for radical genuineness, but we want to also recognize that not everyone we meet is ready for radical genuineness, or it's not appropriate to the relationship. Especially, I think, when we first meet someone and we're slowly building trust. So maybe we just start out with, I'm just going to practice being mindfully present with the person in front of me as a way to validate them, as a way to show them respect. And so maybe we start there and then we move up whenever we can.
That's great. Very good.
So, social workers, we can also, again, this isn't just for clients, this isn't just for us relating to our clients, but we can think about how do we validate each other. So, are we listening more than we're speaking? That can be validating. Are we asking each other open ended questions in an attempt to understand the other one? What about responding to any kind of conflict or misunderstandings with a place of curiosity, coming from a place of curiosity and openness rather than certainty or defensiveness? We can also think about how compromise, when possible, is something that is very validating. So if we can give a little, or if we can meet someone in the middle and we can use compromise, that's something, again, that shows respect and is validating. We also want to be working toward resolving conflict. So maybe we can't resolve the conflict today or tomorrow. Maybe we can't resolve it anytime soon, but we can think about are we continuing to work toward resolving any kind of conflict? Are we committed to resolving conflict, even conflict that has taken place again over many weeks or many months or even sometimes many years? Are we working toward that? Have we made that commitment? In DBT, we talk a lot about judgments and reducing our judgments. And by that, Marshall Linehan means, are we reducing judgments that we have about ourselves? Are we reducing the judgments that we have about other people? And are we reducing judgments that we may have about events in the world? So, Marshall Linehan has recognized that judgments almost always keep our emotions high and sometimes even out of control when we have very strong judgments. So we can think about what would it look like to reduce the judgments, to let go of judgments about other people or about events. Again, sometimes the best of us get caught in this polarization of this policy is right, this policy is wrong, this is good for us, this is bad for us. And I think there's some wisdom in recognizing that in that moment we're making some judgments that keep emotions high, but sometimes get in the way of how we're effective in our relationships with each other, and maybe even keeps us from being effective in our relationships with our clients. So we can think about, are my judgments getting in the way of my work? Or are my judgments getting in the way of how I'm relating to my colleagues? Are my judgments getting in the way of how I relate to a supervisor or a manager or a board member or an executive director? So I can think about, is there room to reduce the judgments? And then finally, I think about how we validate each other when we're responding to interpersonal differences and conflicts with that commitment to respect, kindness, and a desire to stay connected.
Amanda, I like that you talked about we can't always resolve conflicts. When I talk with people in the work that I do, I say, sometimes we can resolve a conflict and sometimes we can manage a conflict, but sometimes the only thing that we can do is mitigate the impact on us that the conflict brings, right? Using those coping skills in order to deal with the fact that there's an ongoing conflict and it's not going to end immediately or in the near future, perhaps. And so how to live with it and not have it disrupt our sleep and our relationships and our physical health and our mental health, right? Just the ability to mitigate the consequences of the conflict, because we can't always just pick up and move or drop somebody, right? There may be our spouse or our, it's somebody we have a connection to, and we can't just walk away, um, as a way to resolve things. So how do we have the capacity to remain in the conflict, especially if it's something important or someone important? And so I talk to people about how to mitigate those stressors that come from that conflict.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. And I think that's a reality of thinking about sometimes ineffective or even broken systems, that conflict makes sense when we think about those systems or we think about those organizations. And, just because we don't like something doesn't mean that anything's going to change or that anything's going to be different. So maybe we need to work on tolerating that conflict rather than, think about like, oh, well, it just can't be this way. So, I mean, I think how conflict is a part of life. Misunderstandings are a part of life. So, so maybe even while we're working to resolve the conflict, maybe we also accept that, yeah, conflict makes sense given this particular system or these particular challenges within the system. So, yeah, I think you're correct.
The other thing that kind of just comes to mind, or another thing that comes to mind to me, is just within the last few days, I saw a post on the My NASW board where Zander and I met, and it was, the author asked, here we are a year after, approximately a year after President Trump was elected. Has your mind changed at all? And the responses were primarily no, we should march, we should go do a no King's March and so forth. And I thought, just by asking that question, sometimes we ask social workers questions in such a way that might invite conflict rather than taking a dialectical approach and saying, what do you like and what do you not like? Or what do you still not like? Or what have you appreciated? Because I mean, I'll tell you that I've certainly enjoyed seeing hostages return home on the news over the last few days. It's very heartwarming, and I think that's something good. At the same time, today some tariffs went into effect. I'm not sure I'm a big fan. Well, I'll just tell you, I'm not a big fan of tariffs and the impact that it has on the economy, and can only hope the longer term it might work out. But right now, it doesn't look like it is. Or, how he, we could go on and on just talking about different things, but rather than seeing people in black and white terms, just recognize that, yeah, there's things that you like about our different experiences, our different interactions, or things you didn't like. And even our podcast tonight, I had to, reschedule or, move it back a little bit at a time. I'm sure you didn't like that, but I appreciate that overall you said, you know what, it's going to be worth the time that we can have to talk through this. And I appreciate your your willingness to stick with it, even though I had to make a last minute change.
I, I'm glad everything worked out, and it did work out. So,
Well, I just think that, in our world today, that sometimes we invite conflict where we can maybe be more effective as social workers in taking a dialectical approach.
sure, absolutely, absolutely. Which is why I want my clients to know about this. I want them to be able to practice this, and then I want to share these ideas with others because I do think it makes that much of a difference. So we can practice these ideas, we can practice validation by looking at both sides of a particular problem or a particular situation that may come up for lots of different people in lots of different workplaces. These are pretty common dilemmas for lots of social workers. The first one is a colleague says, this new agency policy is helping us to meet clients where they are. Our services are now more accessible to more individuals in our community. And another colleague points out that that might be true, but this policy may also contribute to professional burnout for our social workers. Many of them already feel like they are contributing all that they can. So, this can be an intellectual exercise. We can argue one side and then we can argue the other. We can validate one side and then we can validate the other. We can find that kernel of truth in both sides. And then the second example, an MSW graduate has just been hired for her first professional position, but supervision is not included. A respected mentor has recommended someone for supervision, and he seems like an excellent fit, but he also charges $150 an hour for supervision. The graduate's agency is willing to reimburse up to $3,000 per year towards supervision, trainings, and conferences. The graduate values social workers getting paid what they're worth, but the cost is still a stretch. So, again, at any given moment, we have things like this that come up all the time. They come up in our workplaces, they come up for our clients. And if we can be that person, if we can be that social worker who looks at both sides and is able to validate both sides, then we've probably helped ourselves. I think that we probably helped our colleagues, our clients, our agencies, just to kind of recognize, yeah, there's another side to this.
I like that second example because that's very common.
Mhm.
And my mind immediately started thinking about, well, maybe if I find another person and we can share the hour, or, immediately start thinking about like maybe you could negotiate a lower price because you're paying, not your agency. Like I immediately wanted to problem solve for that poor new professional.
Absolutely, absolutely. But that's a really good point because I think often validation leads to problem solving. I think that's just kind of a natural outcome. We're validating the other person and then maybe everything's not perfectly clear about what we should do next, but sometimes we have some ideas because someone has validated us or because we validated ourselves in this dilemma or within this problem, and then things don't look quite so scary or so confusing. So yeah.
The other thing that, the first example kind of brought to mind was the course that Zander and Nafis, Dr. Alam and I, we did recently on point counterpoint
Mhm.
practice. It's not necessarily point counterpoint with somebody else, but it's doing a point counterpoint, within your own mind, with your own, being able to see different perspectives. So I really like what you've done there.
So it's also important, I think, to recognize what validation is not. We want to think about how validation does not mean agreement. If I'm validating someone, I don't necessarily agree with them or their idea, but there's still something there that I can validate. Similarly, validation is not approval, nor is it consent. Sometimes people have this idea, well, if I validate this other person and their idea, then that might make me look weak, or it might make me look like I'm giving in or I'm giving up. But I would suggest that validation is not any of those things. Validation is, again, just acknowledging someone else's thoughts, their emotions, their values, their beliefs, their goals, their ideas. So we can validate other people. We can validate our colleagues. We can validate, again, our clients. I tell my clients everyone needs validation. Your parents need validation. Your kids need validation. The barista who made your coffee this morning, they need validation. So we can think about how are we validating others and is this a priority? I want for my clients to make it a priority. I want to see them validating a lot of different people in their lives. And again, we can validate others, but still be fully committed to our own personal, our own professional values, beliefs, goals, and ideas. Just because I validate someone else does not mean that I'm in full agreement with them. I'm just acknowledging that they have a particular point of view. That's all that we're doing with validation.
Amanda, uh, I would suspect that a lot of people might interpret a validation of their experience or thoughts or feelings as an agreement with or
Mhm.
endorsement of, right? So we'd probably have to be really clear about that. The second thing that came to mind was in the mid 1980s when they put in um, parking garage in a mall downtown in San Diego where I was serving in the Coast Guard. It was like if you were going to the mall, it was free, but if you were going to anything else around the area, you had to pay for parking. And one of the ways that you could prove that you had actually been in the mall is you could get your parking ticket validated. And I remember that the parking machine said, don't forget to be validated. And so if there was anybody in the car with me, I would turn to them and say, "You're a wonderful person." And they'd be like, "What are you saying?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm validating you. It tells me right there I should be validating you." So it's so funny that that's all these years. I mean, it's almost 2026. So I don't even know. I can't count in my head how many decades that is, but several. And I was, even because we weren't talking in this way in 1986 in a broad, way of validating people. But I knew exactly what it meant, but I was using it in that silly way.
Right, right. I love that so much. I love that. Yes, yes. Lots of different ways that we can validate parking or each other. Yeah, thank you. All right. So, also when we think about how we tolerate differences, how we tolerate all the things that come up that sometimes create some emotional dysregulation, again, for all of us. I love this idea from Marsha Linehan when she's talking about some of these distress tolerance skills or ideas. And she puts this in this beautifully simplistic way. She says, the first rule is if you're in a crisis and you can solve the problem now, absolutely you want to solve it. And then the second part is the second rule of crisis survival is if you can't solve the problem, you need to survive it. So we can think about, okay, if I can't solve this problem that is causing me a lot of emotional dysregulation, the problem that is, whatever it is that's going on in the workplace or at an agency or with a client, if I can solve the problem, I want to solve it. But sometimes I can't solve the problem. So if I can't solve it, I need to survive it. So we can think about what that looks like. All right, the next slide. So we can think about all these different ideas for tolerating everyday distress. Not even everyday distress, but everyday and extraordinary distress. I think that it's important to acknowledge that exploring differences and resolving conflict can be a very painful process for a lot of people. Emotions come up, people feel very strongly one way or another. So we can just validate that this can be a difficult, painful experience for either for ourselves or for other people. Social workers can learn that they can distract from their emotional pain in healthier ways where they don't make a bad situation worse. And we can think about all the ways in which we have at times in our lives made a bad situation worse. I hope I'm not the only person who has sent a text or an email without waiting an hour or 24 hours. That has been a way in which I have made a bad situation worse. I'm going to tell this person what I think or what they should do or what should happen next without thinking through how I'm communicating with that other person. So we can think about, okay, what am I doing to help myself while I'm waiting that out, while I'm trying my best, recognizing that I'm doing my best and I also need to try harder, um, work to improve. And I think about the coping skills or the problem solving skills that we share with our clients. So we can find these in CBT or DBT or ACT. So we're already sharing a lot of these ideas with our clients. And I think it's important to remember that these skills or ideas aren't just for our clients, they're also for us. So, what are those ideas? What are those skills? Do we need to? A couple of years ago, I took a wonderful online course called DBT for therapists. So this wasn't a training for how to teach the DBT skills to clients. This was therapist. You need DBT skills. So we're teaching you these skills so that you can use these skills for yourself. So I think it's important to recognize that all of us need ways of coping, healthy ways of coping, ways to problem solve. And we can, again, these ideas aren't just for other people, they're for all of us. So we can think about, okay, what works or what helps other people may also help us. So what skills or ideas do we need as social workers? And then I also think about social workers. Do we need professional support and guidance? And then is that going to come from? Are we getting it from a supervisor or a colleague, a consultant? Do we need to have our own therapist or do we need to be a part of a support group? What do we need? Recognizing this truth that social workers need support. So, where is that support coming from? How are we getting it? When conflict comes up, when problems come up that we can't resolve or we can't resolve right away, where are we getting the help that we need? Certainly, supervisors can teach dialectical thinking and these ideas of how we validate others to supervisees. We can teach these ideas of, dialectical thinking to students, to BSW students, to MSW students, to PhD students, to DSW students. I think all students need a framework for understanding other people's perspectives, and understanding problems from the perspective of another person, another group. So we want people to have those kind of skills to help themselves. And I would argue that dialectical thinking can be a way to help people who are learning. Also, social workers can find meaning and purpose outside of work. We don't always talk about this, but I think it's true. Social work doesn't always have to be our identity. So we can think about, okay, this is my career, or this is my license, or this is how I define myself professionally. However, it doesn't have to be my entire identity. So, where else am I finding meaning and purpose in my life? If it's only through work, that might be something that's problematic. But if I'm finding meaning and purpose in lots of different areas of my life, then maybe that helps me to get the support I need, the help I need. Maybe that helps me ultimately to be a better social worker or a healthier social worker. Also, I think about how, we value self determination, and self determination isn't just for our clients. I know that when I have felt stuck at work, I can remind myself that I have choices. So I'm not powerless, I'm not helpless, I'm not hopeless. I can think about what changes I need to make in my own life, either professionally or personally, in order to act in a way that is an expression of my values, my beliefs, my goals, my ideas, whatever it is. So, self determination, not just for clients, but an idea for social workers as well. I think this I think this can make a difference when we're thinking about how are we tolerating things that sometimes feel intolerable. So,
Well, that's great. Those are some really good applications. And as I look at them, I, find myself thinking, oh man, I could do a little better here with some of these things. Sometimes I do have to look at my choice and, don't make it worse. Don't, dwell on it and fixate on it or continue to pick at it in myself or others. Sometimes you just keep going, even if you're not fully resolved with whatever conflict I may be facing. So this is really good. Thank you very much, Amanda. I
thank you.
was going to ask you, how would you how would you just apply this? You're talking to somebody, you're in an intense conflict. Have you ever experienced this yourself? When somebody's coming at you pretty aggressively, they don't agree with something you did at work, perhaps with a colleague, perhaps with somebody who has a different viewpoint than you do, a different values, different preferences. Have you had an experience where you've used these skills yourself?
All the time. Yes, all the time. One of Marshall Linehan's suggestions, one of my rules of thumb that feels like it works more often than not is to start with validation. And then once the other person begins to feel heard and understood and respected, then that may be the time to move on to problem solving. I know for myself, I want to solve the problem. I want to jump in. I want to start offering suggestions, or I want to give advice, or I want to tell people what to do. But when I just start with validation, I slow things down. I'm mindfully present. I let go of that s- tendency that I know I have toward certainty and then maybe sometimes defensiveness, and I just listen. Usually, I think that's enough to resolve a lot of problems, our own problems, other people's problems, all the problems we run into at any given moment. And yet, it's so hard to do when I think about how social workers, for the most part, are professional problem solvers. We have resources, we have ideas, we want to create a plan, a treatment plan, or we want to start putting things into action. And sometimes it's nice to remember that it's okay to slow things down long enough and just listen and just be present with the other person, with whatever it is that's happening. And I think that's also a pretty nice way to approach conflict and problems as well. Slow things down, listen, let go, respond with curiosity. Again, I'm the first to admit that I this does not come naturally, and I'm getting better. I still have work to do, but I think it works most of the time.
It's a practice, right?
Mhm.
So it's like anything else. The more you do it, the better you get at it, and probably the more reinforcement in lower stress times will make it easier for us to remember to call on these strategies when we're in higher stress times, right? Because we're not just leaving it until we're in high stress. We're practicing it in everyday situations. I think that's going to make it more available to us as a strategy.
Absolutely. Which is why I think it's important to think about how are we validating our spouse, or how are we validating the barista who made our coffee, or how are we validating um, the person we ride with on the elevator in the morning. If we can validate in those ways, then when an extraordinary challenge comes up for us, we already have, like you said, that practice and those skills. So it just becomes a lot easier. And then it's less likely that we quickly move into problem solving or defensiveness or, well, this has to be the answer and this has to be what we do next. But it's tempting to go there, I think.
It is indeed. Well, this is very practical, very helpful, relevant to what we do in seeking for skills to help people in a variety of ways, clinically as well as just personally and pragmatically. So, thank you very much, Amanda, for your time and for your preparation for this course. It's been wonderful. I can see so many applications to what we do in many different venues. Zander, any final thoughts, final words?
Well, I won't repeat, I'll just say echo to what you said. And yeah, it for me, I like to reinforce information that I've already learned because then it reminds me, oh, there's a step I've been missing, or maybe I haven't really applied this generally. I've been reserving it for specific people or specific situations, or I've only been applying it externally. I've forgotten to apply it internally. So I just appreciate the tutorial, right? The remedial, or the reminder to that there's a whole set of strategies that I could be putting into practice more often. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Amanda, go ahead and share any last thoughts you have, and then I'll close it out.
I just want to acknowledge, I think that this idea of thinking dialectically or practicing dialectics, I think that practice makes a difference, and we have to be committed to that practice. For most of us, these ideas don't come easily or naturally, so we can think about little things that we can do to pause, think dialectically, kind of check in with ourselves. And again, I really do like it when people kind of push back and say, well, have you considered this or have you considered that? So there's something to being open to, that occasional pushback from others. Instead of understanding it as a threat, we can understand it maybe as an invitation to learn more, to again just have that different perspective that can help us to grow.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful, very pro-social. Relation. It can be intra, social within ourselves as well. Trying to reconcile some of those dialectics within, and as well as with other people, with people that with whom we interact. So this has been wonderful, Amanda, and we look forward to our continued association. This is so. Thank you very much, Amanda. Social workers are awesome. They have a website, correct?
Yes.
SocialworkersAreawesome.com and hopeforbpd.com,
Yes.
correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the other one?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I'll look Amanda up, and if you're interested in more information. Also, our content that we produce through Pro Social Workers is pro social. It's free, but for those who are seeking continuing education credits, this course will qualify. We'll get it up on our website, and you can find that at prosocialworkers.com. Pay a small fee. You'll get some continuing education. And Amanda, thank you so much for your time and attention. Thanks, Zander, for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Pro Social Workers podcast. We're grateful to our guests for sharing their insights, and to you, our listeners, for being part of this journey. If you'd like to earn continuing education credits, don't forget to visit our website at prosocialworkers.com. where you can register, pay a fee, complete a course evaluation, and take a quick quiz. We look forward to having you with us next time as we continue to explore how we can put the social back into social work.